Welcome, everybody, to the Institute for Work and Health Speaker Series presentation for Tuesday, February 13th, 2024. My name is Peter Smith. I am the President and Senior Scientist here at the Institute for Work and Health. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Faraz Vahid Shahidi, who will be presenting to us today on a recent study that's been completed on precarious employment as an occupational hazard. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about Faraz, and then I will describe some of the housekeeping for today's presentation. Faraz is an associate scientist here at the Institute for Work and Health. He's a social epidemiologist by training, and his research aims to understand how societal conditions, such as the nature and the organisation of work, shape the health and safety of working people. As I said today, Faraz will be talking to us about a study on precarious employment as an occupational health hazard and the relationship between precarious employment and work-related injury and illness. In terms of asking questions for today, we should have plenty of time at the end of today's presentation for a discussion. If you would like to ask a question, there's just been a note put into the chat box about please use the Q&A feature to ask any questions you might have had. You can also turn on the closed captioning feature on or off by going to the bottom of the screen and clicking. To save you from asking the question about will there be a copy of the presentation made available? Yes, there will. There will be a copy of the presentation, the recording of the presentation available on the IWH website for in about a week and a bit, maybe 2 weeks. And if you've registered for the presentation, you will receive an email notification telling you when that has happened. So with that, I will now open the floor to Faraz to take us through today's presentation. I'll see you at the end.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for tuning in today. I'll start just by extending our thanks to the WSIB and to the Toronto Region Statistics Canada Research Data Centre for facilitating access to the data that we needed to conduct this study. This research I'm presenting today also wouldn't have been possible without the core funding that the Institute receives from the Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. Though I want to stress that today I'm speaking on my own behalf and on behalf of the study team. No endorsement from the ministry is intended, nor should an endorsement be inferred. I also, of course, want to thank other members of the study team, Ching Lau, Peter Smith, Victoria Landsman, Cameron Mustard, Linda Robson, and Avi Biswas, all of whom are colleagues of mine here at the Institute for Work and Health. Some key messages that I hope you'll walk away with at the end of this presentation. So in our study of nearly 300,000 lost time compensation claims in the province of Ontario, workers who were more likely to experience precarious employment were more likely to sustain an occupational injury or illness. We also found that workers who were more likely to experience precarious employment were more likely to have contracted an occupational or work-related COVID-19 infection. Our results suggest that precariously employed workers are at greater risk in some part because they're employed in more hazardous occupations, but other factors also appear to be at play. And if you want to know more about what I mean by that, you'll have to stick around. Ultimately, the conclusion we draw from our findings is that workplace health and safety strategies should more carefully consider the role of precarious employment, both as an occupational hazard and as a general marker of risk in the labor market. So what do I mean by precarious employment? The first thing to note in this regard is that there is no official definition of precarious employment in Canada. Precarious employment, however, generally is meant to describe a state of insecurity or uncertainty in the terms and conditions of a person's employment. So when one or more aspects of a person's employment is insecure or uncertain, we might describe that person's employment as being precarious in character. So what sorts of features are we looking for when trying to sort of measure precarious employment? Well, typical features include things like contractual instability. So are you on a temporary as opposed to permanent contract? Earnings inadequacy. So are you paid low wages? Schedule unpredictability. Do you have irregular hours that can change and maybe you don't know what they are in advance? And limited working time control. The classic example here being, I work part-time, but I have a preference, a desire for full-time work. Important to note that according to the 2017 Changing Workplaces Review, which was an independent review commissioned by the Government of Ontario, precarious employment could be affecting as much as 1/3 of the workforce in Ontario, so not a small number of workers. Why would precarious employment matter from an occupational health and safety perspective? Well, as it turns out, precarious employment is associated with several factors that are known to increase a person's risk of work injury. So precariously employed workers tend to receive less health and safety training. They tend to have higher rates of turnover, frequently having to move between different jobs and work sites. Because they sometimes fall between the cracks of health and safety legislation, they often have fewer rights and protections at work. They tend to report higher levels of stress, fatigue, burnout. They often lack representation in the workplace, so union representation or health and safety representation. And of course, they tend to have higher levels of job and income insecurity. These are all potential consequences of precarious employment that are also well-known risk factors for work injury. And they're risk factors for work injury because they either increase a person's likelihood of being exposed to hazardous conditions, or because they increase a person's likelihood of experiencing the harms associated with those hazardous conditions. So just to give you some flavor of what I mean here, if I don't have adequate health and safety training, I might not be able to identify and appropriately manage risks at work. If I'm frequently having to move between jobs and across work sites, I may have a limited awareness of site-specific hazards and safety protocols. If I'm stressed and fatigued, my decision-making might be impaired. My reaction times at work might be impaired. If I don't have a union, or if I'm sort of constantly worried I'm going to lose my job if I speak up, I might not feel comfortable reporting a hazard or advocating for safer working conditions, or even refusing work that I think is unsafe for me. So for all these reasons and more, precarious employment is hypothesized to increase health and safety risks at work. So with that hypothesis in mind, what is it that we can learn from previous research on the relationship between precarious employment and occupational health and safety? Well, studies generally find that precariously employed workers are more likely to be exposed to hazardous physical and psychosocial working conditions, consistent with the hypothesis I laid out on the previous slide. But when it comes to the impact of precarious employment on occupational injuries and illnesses, evidence is much less consistent and quite mixed. In fact, several high-quality studies recently published have found that precarious employment is associated with a lower risk of occupational injury and illness. So quite a counterintuitive pattern here. On the one hand, a group of workers that demonstrably is exposed to hazards, to greater levels of hazards, but on the other hand, is not necessarily reporting higher rates of injury and illness at work. One potential explanation for this counterintuitive pattern of findings may be the fact that existing studies, previous studies, have generally not adequately accounted for the fact that precariously employed workers, by definition, spend less time at work and therefore less time at risk of sustaining an injury or illness. And the clearest example of this is part-time work. By definition, part-time workers spend less time at work than their full-time counterparts. And if we don't factor that difference into our calculations of injury rates, we risk arriving at conclusions that are not only biased, but also potentially misleading. And we can think of this issue as a kind of missing denominator problem. So in order to calculate an accurate rate, say the rate of injuries among precariously employed workers, I need to know not only how many injuries occurred within that group, that's the numerator. I also need to know the amount of time that that group spent at risk of incurring an injury. So how much time did they actually spend at work exposed to the thing that could cause them to sustain an injury? That's the denominator. Unfortunately, this denominator is often missing in our data. So for instance, when a worker submits a compensation claim, we don't generally collect information on their hours of work. But without this information about the denominator, we are seriously restricted in our ability to accurately estimate injury rates among precariously employed workers or sort of any other population group. Luckily, this is a limitation that we can sort of work around by bringing in complementary information from Statistics Canada's labor force survey. And this is precisely what we set out to do in our study. So our overall aim was to examine the relationship between precarious employment and occupational injuries and illnesses, taking better account of that missing denominator problem, and hopefully in the process painting a more accurate, reliable picture of the relationship between precarious employment and occupational risks. We pursued that overall aim in sort of two parallel studies, each with its own sort of parallel specific objective. In the first study, we looked at precarious employment in relation to overall, sort of think of it as all-cause occupational injuries and illnesses among Ontario workers between the years 2016 and 2019. In the second study, we looked at precarious employment specifically in relation to one occupational outcome of interest, work-related COVID-19 infections. So COVID-19 infections that were traced back to some workplace exposure. Again, among Ontario workers, this time during the first 2 years of the pandemic. Our study combined two data sources. The first data source provided information on the numerator, how many injuries occurred. The second data source provided information on the denominator, how many people were at risk, and just as importantly, how much time did they spend at work, at risk. Our numerator came from the WSIB and its administrative census of workers' compensation claims. So most of you will, of course, likely know, the WSIB is the public insurance system responsible for compensating workers who experience an occupational injury or illness in Ontario. WSIB coverage extends to approximately 76% of the workforce in Ontario. And within this claims dataset, within this administrative census, we have information on the sex, age, industry, and occupation of claimants. From this complete census of accepted lost time claims, we identified about 244,000 claims for occupational injuries and illnesses. That's between 2016 and 2019. That's study one. And about 43,000 claims for occupational COVID-19 infections from April 2020 to April 2022. Information for our denominator came from the second data source, the labor force survey, which is a monthly survey providing reliable and efficient estimates of the labor force in Canada. Who is at work and how much were they working? How many hours? This survey is representative of approximately 98% of the Canadian household population aged 15 years and over. Again, in this survey, information is also collected on sex, age, industry, and occupation. And importantly, information is collected on hours of work, which is the information we need to accurately estimate the denominator part of our rates. We were interested in looking at 4 indicators of precarious employment: temporary employment, low wages, irregular hours, and involuntary part-time employment. So workers' compensation claims don't provide us with information on employment conditions, including these 4 indicators of employment quality. We had to find a way around this problem, and the workaround involved using information from the labor force survey to develop a job exposure matrix describing not whether a person was necessarily exposed, but a person's probability of exposure to precarious employment. So how did we develop this job exposure matrix describing a person's probability of exposure to precarious employment? Well, very briefly, we first calculated the proportion of workers exposed to a given indicator, say temporary employment or low wages, and we calculated the proportion of workers exposed within each of the 500 occupational titles listed in the Canadian National Occupational Classification. We then rank ordered occupations based on their respective proportions of workers exposed, sorting them into 4 equally sized groups representing occupations with low, medium, high, and very high probabilities of exposure, respectively. So occupations were assigned sort of a value of low probability of exposure to temporary employment or medium probability of exposure to low wages, and so on and so forth. And using workers and claimants' reported occupational titles within the WSIB claims data, we were able to impute via this sort of proxy measure, this job exposure matrix, we were able to assign workers exposure values based on their reported occupations. So a worker could be assigned an occupation with a low probability of exposure to temporary employment, or a worker could be assigned a medium level, a probability rather, of exposure to low wages and so on. Because precarious employment is sort of inherently multidimensional and often involves sort of an accumulation of adverse employment conditions within the same job, we also created a fifth overall indicator of multidimensional exposure, which we assessed in terms of the number of times a worker's occupation was assigned to the very high probability of exposure group. So in our statistical analyses, we wanted to account for underlying differences between precarious and non-precarious workers that could sort of confound or provide alternative explanations for an association between exposure to precarious employment and occupational injuries, illnesses, and infections. So within both of our data sets, we collected and sort of analyzed information on sex, age, and time, with time being assessed in terms of year in study 1, and sort of more appropriately assessed in terms of wave in study 2, since wave rather than year was going to be more predictive of occupational COVID claim rates, sort of background rates and occupational and overall infection rates. In a separate second model, we introduced another set of variables, and we sort of labeled these occupational exposures. The idea here is that we were interested in knowing whether an association between precarious employment and injuries, illnesses, and infections might be because precariously employed workers are more concentrated in occupations characterized by more hazardous exposures. So in the first study, we were interested in occupational exposures that would help us predict overall injuries and illnesses and claims to the WSIB. And based on previous research, we sort of narrowed in on those that were sort of are the strongest predictors of injury and illness overall. And those were physical demands and a sort of index of other workplace hazards measuring things like exposure to electricity, radiation, heat, noise, flying objects, machinery, and so on. In the second study, because we were looking at COVID infections, work-related COVID infections, we sort of shifted over to occupational exposures that previous research, including some research conducted at the Institute by Peter and others, that would predict occupational exposure and occupational risk of COVID-19 infection. And those were public-facing work, so being in an occupation that involves dealing with the public and facing the public directly, your proximity, your physical proximity and closeness to other workers at work, and your primary location of work, like, say, indoor versus outdoor. And if you're interested in, I don't quite have time to tell you more about these indicators, but if you are interested in learning more about them, an article summarizing a study by Peter and others at the Institute has been or will be shared in the chat box for you to go to down the line if you're interested in learning more about these exposures and why we selected them as sort of these strong predictors of occupational risk of COVID-19 infection. So a little bit about our analytic approach. So again, from the WSIB, we pulled our numerator, our monthly estimates of accepted lost time compensation claims, from which we were able to identify how many injuries, illnesses, and infections occurred, at least those resulting in a lost time compensation claim. From the LFS, we pulled our numerator information, so our monthly labor force estimates, giving us an accurate estimate, not just of how many people were at work, but how long they were at work, so hours of exposure to work. And using this combination of numerator and denominator information, we were able to accurately estimate claim rates. And we estimated those claim rates, those rates of injury, illness, and infection, per full-time equivalent, with one full-time equivalent to about 2,000 hours of work. So moving into the findings, what I'm going to do is separate out the findings from the first study on occupational injuries and illnesses from the second study on occupational COVID-19 infections. So this is a stylistic decision. You're going to note that the overall story is similar across these two studies, but because there's quite a batch of results to share with you today, I've decided to sort of separate them. And so we're first going to dive into precarious employment as a kind of predictor risk factor of occupational injuries and illnesses overall between 2016 and 2019. So on this slide, I'm showing injury and illness claim rates across levels of exposure to precarious employment. So the thing to take away from this slide is that claim rates were generally lower in occupations where there was a lower probability of exposure to precarious employment. And sort of in a similar vein, claim rates were higher in occupations characterized by higher probabilities of exposure to precarious employment. The shape of that gradient sort of differed somewhat from one indicator to the next, but the overall pattern, the overall gradient was consistent across indicators, such that lower claim rates appeared where people had a lower probability of precarious employment, and again, higher claim rates where people had higher probability of precarious employment. So things get a little busy on this slide and the next, but we'll take a couple of minutes to sort of work our way through. On this slide, I'm showing a formal statistical measure, a formal statistical test of the association between exposure to precarious employment and occupational injury and illness rates. And the way we sort of show that statistical measure of the association is through risk ratios, which describe the relative likelihood, in this case, of injury or illness in one group compared to another. So on this slide, I'm comparing those in the medium, high, and very high exposure groups to those in the low exposure group. And I'm asking whether workers with medium, high, or very high exposure to precarious employment were at greater risk of sustaining an injury or illness compared to those in the low exposure group. And important to note on this slide, I'm showing risk ratios that are adjusted only for age, sex, and time, so year. And what we found is that the relative risk of injury or illness was greater among those workers with a high and very high probability of exposure to precarious employment. And this is indicated visually by the plotted estimates that fall to the right-hand side of the value 1. So estimates to the right-hand side of the value 1 indicate a greater likelihood, a greater relative risk of injury or illness compared to the low exposure group. And we can sort of focus in on an example and sort of work through to make sure we understand what I'm trying to describe here. So if we narrow in on that multidimensional exposure, what we found is that workers with a sort of medium level of exposure to multidimensional precarity were about twice as likely to sustain an injury or illness resulting in lost time compensation, while workers exposed to high and very high probabilities of multidimensional precarity were about 3 times as likely to sustain an injury or illness. I mentioned that we were interested in seeing what happens when we statistically control additionally for underlying differences in the occupational characteristics, the occupational exposures of precarious and non-precarious workers. And in this case, we were interested again in those occupational exposures that would help us predict overall injury or illness rates, so physical demands and exposure to other workplace hazards, such as heat, noise, machinery, falling objects, and so on. So what happens when we account for these underlying differences between precarious and non-precarious workers in occupational exposures, occupational characteristics? Well, generally, we found that associations became smaller in size, so they were somewhat attenuated when we adjusted for occupational exposures. And that's indicated by the sort of yellow-hued point estimates on the plot compared to the previous blue-hued estimates. Sort of what this attenuation implies is that part of the reason why precariously employed workers have higher rates of injury and illness is because they are employed in occupations that involve greater levels of exposure to hazardous working conditions, like physically demanding work, like heat, radiation, noise, machinery, and so on. But just as importantly, a takeaway from this slide is that even after accounting for these underlying occupational differences, these underlying differences in occupational exposures, precariously employed workers were still sort of presenting elevated risks of injury and illness. So relationships persisted with respect to their statistical and substantive significance and meaning. And we can again zoom in on our example and note that sort of not so much here a signal among those exposed to medium levels of multidimensional precarity, but a sort of continuing, persisting signal for high and very high exposure with a nearly twofold risk of injury or illness, even after accounting for these very important sort of underlying occupational exposures. Shifting now over to this sort of second study, or second set of findings, looking specifically at occupational or work-related COVID-19 infections from 2020 to 2022. Again, I'm showing you sort of COVID-19 related claim rates across increasing levels of exposure to precarious employment. And again, with the exception of low wages here, across the remaining indicators, we again see this sort of overall gradient where claim rates were lower among those with lower probabilities of exposure to precarious employment, and claim rates were higher among workers in occupations with higher probabilities of exposure to precarious employment. Moving over now again to the risk ratios adjusted for age, sex, and time, in this case, wave of the pandemic, we again see that compared to those with a low level of exposure, again, with the exception of low wages, workers exposed to medium and certainly high and very high levels or probabilities of exposure to precarious employment were at a greater risk of sustaining or rather contracting COVID-19 at work. So again, we see our point estimates, particularly for high and very high levels of exposure on the right-hand side of the value 1. And if we look at our specific example of multidimensional exposure, we would sort of characterize the risks or the relative risks as such, sort of among those with medium levels of exposure to multidimensional precarity, a greater than twofold risk of contracting COVID-19 at work, and among those with high and the very highest exposure to multidimensional precarity, 3 to nearly 5-fold risk of contracting COVID-19 in the workplace that results in a claim, in a lost time compensation claim. Again, we ask the question, sort of what happens when we account for underlying differences in the occupational characteristics of precarious and non-precarious workers. Though this time we weren't really interested in physical demands or exposure to noise and heat and radiation. In this part of the sort of analysis, in this study, we were interested in those COVID-19 related occupational exposures. So is your work public facing? Do you work in close proximity to others? And do you tend to work, for example, in sort of unregulated indoor environments? Again, we found that associations were somewhat attenuated. They decreased somewhat in size and magnitude when we accounted for these underlying occupational characteristics of precariously employed workers. The one exception is that our estimates for low wages, which were previously sort of null or non-significant, actually moved rightward and became significant, indicating greater levels of risk among those with higher probabilities of exposure. And this was sort of what we found across all the indicators, even after accounting for these underlying occupational characteristics. So looking at multidimensional exposure, one last time, I promise, among those with medium probabilities of exposure to multidimensional precarity, about 80% greater likelihood of a COVID-19 related claim. And among those exposed to high and very high sort of probabilities of multidimensional precarity, a greater than 3-fold risk of work-related COVID-19 infection resulting in a lost time compensation claim. So I feel like I've thrown a lot at you in these last 6 slides. So I just want to quickly, before wrapping up, summarize what I hope you sort of take away from those results. And I'll wrap again with some key messages soon, but just to sort of summarize what I presented in the last 6 slides. So most importantly, I think, exposure to precarious employment was consistently associated with higher rates of occupational injury, illness, and infection. When we accounted for underlying differences in the occupational nature, sort of characteristics of precarious and non-precarious workers, these associations sort of attenuated. They became a little bit smaller. But notably, they remained for the most part statistically and substantively significant. What we sort of take away from this, what it sort of implies is that it is true that greater exposure to hazards might explain some of the relationship between precarious employment and occupational injuries, illnesses, and infections. But because part of the association and sizable portions of the association persisted, sort of stands to reason that other factors are also at play. And sort of we could think of those factors as vulnerability. So another way of sort of framing this is even at the same level of occupational exposure. So even when they're exposed to the same occupational sort of characteristics and work environment factors, we see elevated risks, a greater likelihood of experiencing the harms associated with those exposures among workers with a greater probability of exposure to precarious employment. So just to quantify that a little bit for you, in the fully adjusted model, workers with high and very high probabilities of exposure to precarious employment presented a nearly twofold risk of injury or illness and a greater than threefold risk of work-related COVID-19 infection. So some strengths and sort of limitations that we kept in mind and that we'd encourage you to keep in mind when thinking about and sort of interpreting our study and findings. So we were really excited to have this opportunity to develop this sort of new proxy measure of precarious employment. And it's exciting because it gives us an opportunity, it provides us a way of measuring precarious employment when in fact we lack a measure of precarious employment, which is sort of neat and in a way sort of validated by our study. We were also better able to account for that missing denominator problem that we're worried has contributed to counterintuitive and sort of mixed findings in the literature. And we did that by sort of bringing in information from the labor force survey to provide information about hours of exposure, about that denominator. We also used the sort of best available source of data on work-related injuries and illnesses in Ontario. So that administrative census of workers' compensation claims to which we were generously provided access by the WSIB. On the limitations side of things, well, as excited as we were about our new proxy measure, our job exposure matrix for precarious employment, generally, almost always, we would prefer to directly measure a person's employment conditions rather than sort of impute or proxy it using a more probabilistic measure like our job exposure matrix. So it would have been great for us to have information on every claimant's sort of employment quality and employment characteristics, but that information isn't collected and contained within the compensation claims data set. We accounted for the occupational exposures that previous research has told us are the most important, the strongest predictors of injury, illness, and infection, but it simply wasn't feasible for us to account for everything under the sun that happens at work and that might distinguish the sort of occupational nature of precarious versus non-precarious jobs. And finally, we know that many injuries, even among workers who are covered by the workers' compensation system, are not reported to the workers' compensation system. And literature in both Canada and internationally consistently tells us that this problem of underreporting is particularly significant among precariously employed workers. What that means is, despite our best efforts, our study has likely still underestimated the true rate of injury, illness, and infection among workers exposed to precarious employment. So to wrap up, we can sort of revisit the key messages that, again, I hope you're walking away with today. So in our study of nearly 300,000 lost time compensation claims in the province of Ontario, we found that workers who were more likely to experience precarious employment were more likely to sustain an occupational injury or illness. We also found that among those workers, those same workers, more likely to experience precarious employment, they were more likely to have contracted an occupational COVID-19 infection. As I sort of noted, it seems that precariously employed workers are at greater risk in some part because they were employed in sort of more hazardous occupations. But an equally important message is that other factors seem to be at play. And we would sort of, we could reasonably group those other factors under this rubric of vulnerability. So even at the same level of exposure, even when they're exposed to the same hazards, there's greater vulnerability. There's a greater likelihood, pardon me, of experiencing the harms associated with precarious employment. Pardon me. Yes, with precarious employment. No, associated with those occupational hazards. Apologies. And again, from a policy and practice perspective, the sort of broader conclusion we draw from the study findings is that workplace health and safety efforts, prevention strategies, should sort of more carefully consider the problem of precarious employment, both as an occupational hazard and more broadly as this kind of marker of occupational risk in the labor market. And that's it for me. Thank you for being here today. I'm happy to answer questions and address any comments. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Faraz, for your presentation. Just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question of Faraz, you can pop it into the Q&A box and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. We already have a number of them in the chat box. Faraz, I'm going to start maybe with some of the more clarification type questions, and then we'll move into some of the more substantive types of questions.
Okay.
Could you just describe for the audience, in terms of workers' compensation claims and accepted workers' compensation claims, lost time claims, what's the definition of that threshold that you need to meet for a workers' compensation claim, in particular around the COVID-19 infections?
Right. So I think the best way to think about the claims that both landed within the WSIB and ultimately, because they were accepted and resulted in lost time, landed in our study are COVID infections that almost certainly were work-related. And we know this because the WSIB and sort of internationally other workers' compensation systems, though to varying degrees, but certainly the WSIB had very clear, strict guidelines for determining the work-relatedness of COVID-19 infections. So again, the way to think about it is that if a COVID-19 related claim ended up in our study because it resulted in an accepted lost time claim, it is almost certainly, by virtue of those strict sort of adjudication guidelines, almost certainly a work-related COVID-19 infection. But sort of a corollary idea is that some work-related COVID-19 infections whose work-relatedness either was ambiguous or simply couldn't be determined would not be included within our study because they, would not have passed that threshold, those guidelines for adjudicating the work-relatedness of COVID-19 infections. So again, if they're in our study, they are almost certainly work-related injuries, illnesses, infections. If they're not included in our study, they have the possibility of being work-related, and they simply didn't meet that threshold.
Right, thank you. We had a couple of questions, and you sort of addressed this a little bit in the limitations around how there could be a potential bias in using workers' compensation claims when it comes to precariously employed workers. So could you, I guess, maybe reiterate why that bias is and what the effect that bias might have on the estimates? And also, if you're aware of any studies that have particularly looked at the rates of submission or acceptance among precariously employed workers compared to non-precariously employed workers when it comes to workers' compensation claims.
Yes, absolutely. So working through Part A and Part B. So for Part A, to accurately estimate a rate, we need to know how many injuries took place. The issue with underreporting is that injuries take place that don't get reported and therefore can't appear in our numerator. So how many injuries occurred? We have an under account because injuries occurred that were never reported and therefore never sort of appeared in our study. This source of bias, this underreporting, is differential between precarious and non-precarious workers. So what do I mean by that? I mean, both precarious and non-precarious workers, we probably have an undercount of their actual number of injuries. But precariously employed workers sort of are more likely than non-precarious workers to not report, to underreport those injuries. So while the numerator is smaller, undercounted for both precarious and non-precarious workers, it's more undercounted for precarious workers than it is for our non-precarious sort of reference group. And what that means is that we have likely underestimated, not just in general injury and illness rates or infection rates, but particularly the injury, illness, and infection rates among precariously employed workers. So when we take that ratio between precarious and non-precarious, we likely have a ratio that is actually smaller than the true ratio. So hopefully that clarifies things for you. And yes, so both in Canada and internationally, researchers, occupational epidemiologists have tried to quantify the extent in general of that bias and in particular for precarious workers. And it was my mistake for not sharing the study, for example, conducted actually at the Institute for Work and Health by Ron Saunders, John O'Grady, and Siobhan Cardoso, that found, for example, that, and this sort of might alarm you, but among precariously employed workers, or rather in this study, they looked at workers on temporary as opposed to permanent contracts. So I should qualify that. Among temporary workers, the rate of underreport among injured Ontario workers was about 80%. So about 80% of temporary workers who were injured in Ontario in this sort of sample did not report their injuries. So we have tried to quantify it. And if you're interested in that study, you can email me and I'd be happy to share it with you. It's an IWH study. And when we have tried to quantify the extent of that error, that bias, that underreporting, it seems to be quite large in general and particularly large in magnitude among, say, temporary workers and presumably other precariously employed workers.
I have popped a link to that study in
Thank
the
you,
chat
Peter.
box for people.
Thank you.
Okay, just a couple more, I guess, more methodological types of questions for us. So in terms of, there's a number of factors that are associated with higher likelihood of being exposed to precarious employment, such as age, sex, race, levels of education. Were you able to control for some or all of these factors in terms of your models?
Yeah, so there are some factors we would have loved to account for, and Peter mentioned some of them, and they include things like race and immigration status. The reason we would have loved to be able to account for them is because they can sort of be factors that both shape your likelihood of being exposed to precarious employment and, for reasons completely unrelated to precarious employment, could shape your likelihood of sustaining an injury, an illness, or infection resulting in a lost time compensation claim. So, for those who are following our sort of other confounders, unfortunately, while that information is contained in a survey like the labor force survey, it's not contained within the administrative census of workers' compensation claims. And because that information was lacking within our compensation claims data set, it simply wasn't possible for us to account for factors like race and immigration. So I hope I've answered the question, but so yes, we would have loved to account for those factors. They are relevant. But unfortunately, because it's a sort of missing information, we weren't able to incorporate those sorts of characteristics into our statistical models, unlike things like age, sex, year, and so on.
Okay, so the next question is about the things which you could account for. So you described in your slides in terms of the relationships between precarious employment and risk of workers' compensation claims. And then you adjusted for various types of other occupational exposures. So some physical exposures within all claims and some particular types of occupational exposures within the COVID-19 claims. One, could you just re-clarify for the audience some of the things that you were able to account for in those analyses? And two, going back to the lead into the studies, could you then describe of the remaining risk, what are the types of things that could be due to in terms of the risk after you've adjusted? What could further explain why precarious employment is related to an increased risk of workers' compensation claim?
Absolutely, great question. So to sort of review what we were able to account for and what we chose to account for, again, with the caveat that we selected those occupational exposures, those characteristics, job conditions, whatnot, that are research tells us are most strongly, by far and above, most strongly sort of predictive of injuries, illnesses, and infections. So in the case of the first study, we first accounted for the single most important predictor that previous research, including research at IWH, has indicated in terms of predicting injury risk. So physical demands. So this was a measure of sort of what sort of strength requirements are sort of inherent to a given job. So are you carrying lighter loads? Are you carrying medium weight loads? Are you pushing or pulling heavy loads, and so on? And the other sort of set of characteristics we accounted for was a single sort of index capturing whether or not a given occupation is likely to have a set of exposures, one or more of them, within their work environment. And that includes things like exposure to electricity in the work environment, exposure to radiation, heat, noise. That says flying objects, but I probably meant falling objects. Exposure to machinery, chemical substances, and so on. In the case of the second study, we thought it would make sense to narrow in on occupational exposures, not that are very strongly predictive of overall injuries and illnesses, but that are very likely and very strongly predictive of COVID infections. And so using sort of something called the occupational, ONET, we were able to sort of impute, based on people's occupations, their likelihood of sort of being involved in work that involves facing the public, which of course would increase transmission risks, whether they were likely to work in close proximity to others, again, that would increase transmission risks, and whether they were likely to work indoor or outdoors. So with the notion that working outdoors likely would predict lower risk and working indoors would predict higher risk, which is what Peter and others have shown in the study we shared. The second question was, or the second part of the question was about, after accounting for these factors, what possibly could be left? What explains what's left of the association? And it's really important to think of it as being comprised of two things. The first thing feeding into the remaining association is any differences in occupational exposures that we didn't or couldn't account for. So for example, you'll notice that I haven't mentioned anything about psychosocial working conditions, psychosocial exposures, sort of like low job control, low social support at work, so on and so forth. And the idea here is that because we haven't controlled for those occupational exposures, those psychosocial working conditions, it's possible that they're actually there, built into the association, even for those yellow-hued estimates, even for our final estimates, because they're not, those differences between precarious and non-precarious workers in psychosocial work exposures are not adjusted for. On the other hand, we think we have done a pretty good job of accounting for, again, those things that are most strongly related to our outcomes. And so the second part of what we think is built in to sort of our second estimates, our final estimates, the yellow-hued estimates, the fully adjusted ones, is the fact that even at the same level of exposure, there's something about precarious employment that could confer additional sort of risks, that they increase the likelihood that a hazard will become a harm. And I provided some examples of that early on in the study, in the presentation. Like for instance, two workers might be exposed to the same unsafe work environment, unsafe sort of hazard or task or so on. One worker, because they're secure, they have job security, they have income security, they have the protection and representation of a union, there's a health and safety representative at work and so on, they will speak up and they will report that hazard and they will sort of even maybe exercise their right to refuse that unsafe work. On the other hand, that precarious worker exposed at an equal level to the same task is simply not going to be able to, because they don't have the support of the union or because they're worried about losing their job, they're sort of less protected from that hazard. It occurs to me, though, I know I'm taking a bit of time here, to provide another sort of example that maybe maybe provides a better illustration of this vulnerability problem, because I'm worried I might have just provided an example of greater exposure. But thinking about this vulnerability problem, this leftover in our associations, I provided the example here of, if I'm frequently moving between jobs, I might have a limited awareness of job-specific hazards and safety protocols. So it's not that compared to my counterpart, I'm exposed to something different. It's that when I'm exposed to that thing, unlike my sort of regular, permanent, full-time counterpart, I simply don't have the knowledge and awareness and training that I need to sort of identify that hazard and address it and mitigate it and get around it, which means I'm more vulnerable. I'm not more exposed, but once I'm exposed, I'm more vulnerable. Sorry, that was a little long-winded, but I do hope it helps clarify this aspect of the study.
We have about 5 minutes to go, and I do want to get through as many questions as possible for us.
Let's do it.
I do want to. So one's a simple one, and I'm going to ask two, which are a bit bigger and a bit broader. So the first one is around if you have looked at differences across the different nature of injuries. So is precarious employment associated with certain types of injuries? Did you look at that? I mean, we saw the COVID-19 infections, but did you look at other nature of injury groups? In particular, were psychological injuries included in this particular study?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to be quick. So we did not disaggregate all cause injuries and illnesses by sort of cause specific or nature of injury. We would love to in the future, and it makes good sense to do that, because there might be some sort of more acute things that are, because they're more acute, are more related to sort of immediate sort of experiences of precarity, and those more long-term with a different sort of natural history of outcomes might have a different association. In general, though, I will say that sort of some of these nature of injuries, these sub-nature of injuries, are small in size, and it could be difficult to explore them. But we'd certainly love to try in the future. It's a great question, a reasonable question, and certainly something for us to do in the future that I think we're interested in doing.
So in terms of some other things, so one of the things you found was different dimensions of precarious employment seem to have different relationships with work injuries. In particular, like low-wage employment didn't have a strong relationship with the COVID-19 claims, and I think irregular employment had quite a strong relationship with some of the physical claims and in the COVID-19 claims. Is this finding unique? Have other studies shown that different dimensions of precarious employment have different impacts on work injury risk, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, great question. So yes, we are essentially here reproducing a broader finding that you do tend to see in previous literature, so not unique to our study. What I would say, though, and thinking back to the key messages, is that in previous studies, when there's been inconsistency across dimensions, part of that inconsistency in dimensions actually involves counterintuitive findings. So elevated risk for some dimensions and like sort of sizably reduced, measurably reduced risks for other dimensions. So not just lack of consistency across dimensions, but actually relationships that move in different directions. And one aspect, and again, I'm trying to stick to the key messages here, one important aspect of our findings is that even if there was inconsistency across dimensions, generally, especially in our fully adjusted model, generally, the overall story is the same. So estimates generally, especially for the high and very high exposure groups, fall to the right-hand side of one. Whereas in previous studies, part of the inconsistency, the variability across dimensions has actually implied opposite directions. In terms of broader implications, I think that's something that future studies would have to tell you. And part of the issue here is that sort of how many people fall in which of these exposure groups can actually vary from one indicator, one dimension to another. So even if the relative risk might not be as big for an indicator, if lots of people fall in that category of exposure, it can actually be a more consequential sort of, it can capture a more consequential number of injuries, illnesses, or infections that we're trying to prevent. So there are some nuances there that we can't quite get into, and I can't quite get into today, but certainly something that future work could look at and arguably should.
Okay, last question, and I'm sorry to only give you a couple of minutes to answer this one. In terms of precarious employment, so you've shown in this study, this association, a fairly strong and robust association between precarious employment and risk of injury. In terms of the practical implications, your thoughts on, so is the message now to try and minimise precarious employment, or is the message now that we need to do more to make precariously employed workers safe by addressing some of the other inequalities that you've talked about in terms of safety training, exposure to hazards, connections, benefits, communication? Just your thoughts on practically now, what's the advice in 2 minutes for policymakers from this study?
Yeah, so inbuilt in the question is sort of the answer. And so I'm not here to be strongly prescriptive one or another, but I am here to share my thoughts about what's within the universe of possible strategies, interventions, policies, programs, whatnot, to address precarious employment. And so we can think of sort of like a hierarchy of interventions. So from a legislative standpoint, we could focus on things like improving employment standards, both the sort of minimum employment standards, but also with respect to sort of monitoring enforcement of those employment standards. And so a sort of example to concretize that would be if lots of workers have irregular hours, part of employment standards legislation could be around legislating more regular, more predictable hours, which is what some jurisdictions have either done or are currently working on. But moving away from sort of legislation to sort of thinking about the question, prevent precarious employment, there's probably also within this universe plenty of things that at an organizational level and at the level, say, of prevention strategies and workplace inspections and so on, of understanding that precarious employment also sort of is a marker of risk. So what do I mean by that? I mean that employers at an organizational level, among workers who we think by virtue of their precarity are less likely to get adequate health and safety training, are less likely to feel empowered and safe speaking up and so on, workplace level sort of policies and programs could help tackle that, those intermediaries, those sort of factors, those risk factors on the pathway from precarious employment to injury and illness risks that are more modifiable and amenable to something like workplace interventions. For things like workplace inspections, we can think about how we now have evidence that in occupations where there's a high prevalence, a high rate of precarious employment, we also have high rates of injury, illness, and infection, right? So we can use this aspect of occupations to help guide and target our inspection and enforcement efforts. So again, that's not so much about preventing precarious employment, but about responding to it when it's there, when we see it in those occupations, industries, or sectors where it exists. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what's within the range of sort of the universe of possibility, and it'll be up to other people to decide on their actions.
Great. Thank you very much, Faraz, and thank you everyone for joining us. Just a reminder, Sabrina's just put it in the chat box for people, our next Open Speaker Series presentation will take place on March 19. The topic of that presentation is understanding the occupational health and safety motivations and needs in small businesses, and that'll be presented by Dr. Bashak Yanar and Cameron Mustard. So that's March 19 on 2024. If you would like more information on the IWH Speaker Series, if you're joining us for the first time today, please go to www.iwh.on.ca/subscribe, and you can subscribe. There it is in the chat box as well. Thank you, Sabrina. You can subscribe to all our email updates and alerts, including those on the Speaker Series. Thank you again, Faraz, for your presentation. Thanks, everyone, for the great questions and for joining us today. And we'll see you all again on March 19. Goodbye.